my name is Gary Arnell, and welcome to Culture Stack. In this episode, what I wanted to do is, I'm recording on Constitution Day, September 17th, and I was assigned to speak on the subject of the Constitution in my church. I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we believe the Constitution is an inspired document. And so once or twice a year on the 4th of July or around the 4th of July or Constitution Day, we will talk about the Constitution, and usually the conversation centers around statements about the Constitution by our church leaders, about how it's inspired, how we revere it. But rarely, it seems to me, do we actually get into the Constitution and discuss what is it about the Constitution that we revere? What are the underlying principles that are so special? And so we'll talk often about how it's the oldest written, longest surviving written constitution anywhere in the world, that many other constitutions have been sprung from it. It's been copied by many other countries. But again, rarely we get into the actual specific principles of what is it that we are so grateful for, what is it that we're called to protect and safeguard and promulgate into the future. And so for my talk, I wanted to focus more on those ideas. And so I wrote the talk. Turned out it was way too long, so I had to cut out a lot of it from the one I delivered earlier today. So I'm re-recording it where I can do it in more of a conversational podcast tone. Slow it down because I spoke way too fast trying to get through the material, and also be able to share all that I had prepared, which is even so still just a fraction of all that you could talk about, of course, on the Constitution. So thanks for joining me today, and I hope it's thought-provoking for you. The language of my talk is, as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I use a lot of the scriptural and prophetic language from within our version of Christianity. But the principles themselves are, of course, applicable to all Americans and to really everyone. We believe that the Constitution was written for the benefit of all mankind, not just for America. And I'll just get into it and perhaps editorialize as I go. One question you might ask is why we speak of the Constitution in a church setting. And one of our church leaders, his name is Dallin H. Oaks. He's a former Utah Supreme Court justice, and now a leader of our church at the global level. He spoke in our semi-annual general conference 2 years ago on the subject of the Constitution, which other leaders have done in the past. He made the mention in this particular one that political choices and affiliations should not be the subject of teachings or advocacy in any of our church meetings. And so in this assignment, I followed that not just counsel, but that insistence, which I appreciate and I agree with. And so I just discussed the underlying inspired principles undergirding and within the Constitution, while abstaining from discussing political choices or affiliations. I believe that if we are taught correct principles, we can govern ourselves, in this case, quite literally. And we don't actually have to speak about political parties. The principles will speak for themselves, and we can then elect, vote and elect people into office accordingly. Latter-day Saints believe, according to Doctrine and Covenants sections 98 and 101, that God established the Constitution for the rights and protection of all flesh, not just Americans, that it belongs to all mankind, and that God did so by the hands of wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose. So it's a very special and sacred document for us. Many of our church leaders have spoken on the Constitution. Joseph Smith, who's our first prophet in this modern dispensation, Wilford Woodruff, David O. McKay, Harold B. Lee, Ezra Taft Benson, Dallin H. Oaks, have all spoken in general conference, which is kind of the authoritative place to speak in defense of the Constitution. President Benson was unusually spoke out with unusually strong language with regards to the Constitution. There was one general conference in which he said, quote, "We have as a nation apostatized in various degrees from different constitutional principles as proclaimed by the inspired founders." Now that's a very heavy word in our denomination, apostasy. It denotes a leaving, a departure from an inspired course. So God gives us a course to follow, and we've departed from it. And so here is someone who we revere as a prophet of God, saying that we have apostatized, departed from the course that God himself set when he inspired men to create the Constitution. Now that's a big deal, I think. I'm not sure that we take that, that we heed or feel the gravity of that like we ought to when a prophet says we have apostatized as a nation. And in this talk, I go over 7 principles. We could go over many others, 7 principles that I believe we have apostatized from. You can listen and do your own research and decide for yourself. But President Joseph Fielding Smith, who was a predecessor of Benson, declared also in General Conference, quote, It is time the people of the United States were waking up with the understanding that if they don't save the Constitution from the dangers that threaten it, we will have a change of government," end quote. So again, the question is, what are the dangers that threaten it that we need to be on the lookout for so that we don't have a change of government? Most LDS members, church members, are familiar with the prophecy from Joseph Smith that, quote, "This nation will be on the very verge of crumbling to pieces and tumbling to the ground. And when the Constitution is on the brink of ruin, this people will be the staff upon which the nation shall lean, and they shall bear the Constitution away from the very verge of destruction," end quote. So I've been studying the Constitution and the principles upon which it was founded for about 2 decades. And I add my witness to that of Joseph F. Smith and Joseph Fielding Smith and Ezra Taft Benson, that the danger is real, the apostasy is real, and the brink of ruin is discernible or describable. We can actually say, here's where we've gone wrong. And I think it's important for Americans in general, not just Latter-day Saints, to be able to understand that so we can oppose the policies that move us further in that direction. And we promote those policies that move us away from that brink and back to the inspired principles upon which the Constitution was founded. Individual and political freedom is a recipe with very specific ingredients, which we don't really learn in school. I'll speak for myself, but I did not learn these in school. I learned that there's a separation of powers, there's checks and balances, but that really is it's a technical exploration of the Constitution. It really doesn't get you into the details of why did they set things up that way. For those of you who bake or cook, you know that if you materially deviate from a recipe, you get a very different outcome. I mean, even so much as whisking the batter too long, for even just a few moments too long, can give you a very different product that you're trying to make. And individual and political freedom is a recipe with specific ingredients. And I don't think we study them to the degree that we should, so we can understand, hey, we're baking this cake of freedom, we're baking it wrong. So I'm hoping I can shed some light on some of those principles in this podcast. Now, I believe it's necessary to speak of the Constitution in a church setting. That's what I wrote this for, because it was essential to the establishment of the restored gospel and is essential to its forward progress. It's necessary because it and its underlying principles are for the benefit, happiness, and prosperity of all mankind, not just Americans. And to quote one American president, "If we lose freedom here, there is no place to escape to. This is the last stand on earth." So what are those principles that we so dearly revere and must so vigilantly protect? Is it that no one under the age of 35 can be elected president? Is it that senators shall serve for a term of 6 years? And I would say no, that those are technical details, like I mentioned a moment ago. They're the ones our children will be quizzed on. They're easy to quiz on a civics exam, but you have to look deeper to see the principles that were inspired by God, the principles that we have deviated from, and arguably, if we're to believe Benson, that we have perhaps apostatized from. I'm going to cover 7 in this talk today. The first one is what is our human nature, and from where do we get our human rights? What are they? So human nature and human rights. In the book of Genesis, we learn that we are all created in the image of God. This idea of imago Dei, the Latin, was revolutionary. From it flows the idea that we are God's children with a God's given heritage, nature, and destiny. We are all equal before him. We are our brother's keeper, not our brother's master. We are individually sovereign, which is where we get the idea that the power is vested in the people. Life is God's to give or take, not ours, except in self-defense. So from that idea, that imago Dei, that image of God idea, was born our fundamental, inalienable, or human rights, our right to life, to liberty, and to the pursuit of happiness. But not happiness as we define it, but rather happiness as God defines it. So life is sacred because God gave it to us. We can't take it from others, except in the defense, of our own life and liberty. Liberty we'll talk about in a minute, but let's talk for a moment about this idea of the pursuit of happiness. It's a curious phrase found in the Declaration of Independence, and I spent a lot of time trying to understand where that phrase came from and what it meant. And if you trace the meaning of that phrase, pursuit of happiness, from Jefferson and Franklin, or from the drafting committee of the Declaration, back through John Locke to Epicurus and Aristotle, you'll find that the pursuit of happiness meant the pursuit of godliness. You won't hear that anywhere else. That's buried deep in the books. You will not hear that. I've never heard it anywhere else, but I found it. It's right there in Aristotle. 350 years before Christ, Aristotle described in exquisite detail how each of us has a voice inside of us, a divine voice that tells us how to act, that tells us the difference between good and evil, that guides us in living a godlike life, a life of virtue, in developing character, which is the core ingredient in happiness. Virtue and character, hard won by listening to the divine voice in each of us. So that was Aristotle. That's what he did. That's very briefly. He wrote a whole book on it. It's called Aristotle's Ethics. I highly recommend it. It's a difficult book. It's long, but it is so powerful and is foundational to understanding Western civilization. 700 years after Aristotle, the prophet Mormon wrote of this same voice, quote, "The Spirit of Christ is given to every man that he may know good from evil," end quote. And Aristotle also taught that if you ignored or disobeyed this voice, it would diminish to the point where you become a beast. He talked about how man could be either an angel on one hand, or near to the angels, or could become a beast on the other hand. And key to that was whether we listened to this divine voice within us or not. So a life of virtue and happiness is synonymous with the life of the gods, Aristotle wrote. The pursuit of happiness is the pursuit of the kind of life lived by the gods, he said, doing as the gods would do to ourselves and to our fellow men. So Jefferson was reading Greek from the age of 9. He knew his Aristotle, he knew his New Testament, read both of them in their original Greek. The pursuit of happiness to the founders was not, as it is often interpreted today, doing whatever happens to float your individual boat. It was a unifying concept. The people could unify around it, based in Judeo-Christian theology and Greek philosophy, or telos, pointing all humans to the same end. So when we think about e pluribus unum, out of many one, there was one objective, there was one definition of virtue, of public virtue, private virtue, of what we were all seeking. We're all, no matter where we're coming from, we're seeking to heed the voice that's inside each of us and building a life, a character filled, a virtue-based character. And there's a whole lot more we could talk about that, and I've written elsewhere about that. So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Liberty is essential to pursuing happiness or godliness because we must choose the good freely. So you don't build virtue or character if someone's coercing you. So you have to have liberty to pursue, to make your choices, to listen to that voice, choose accordingly, and develop your virtue and character over a course of a lifetime. It does no good if coerced. So, or as Mormon taught, quote, except he shall do it with real intent, it profiteth him nothing, end quote. A little note about property. Aristotle taught that it was essential to the complete life, of which happiness is an essential part, because it allows us to be independent, self-sufficient, and generous to our fellow man. So you've got life, liberty, and property. So the change in the language of the Declaration of Independence during its drafting from life, liberty, and property to a life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness was not trivial or random. The final version of happiness was more whole, more comprehensive than the original that just said property. We would know that if we had read Aristotle. So to sum up point number one, we are made in the image of God. Our nature and our rights come from him. Happiness is the object and design of our existence, and the voice of God inside each of us guides us on the path to achieving it. So that's principle number one. And you can ask yourself, have we apostatized from that idea, from those ideas as a nation? And if we have, if we've varied from that, what are the implications? What follows when we deviate in the recipe of liberty, in the recipe of freedom? What do we bake instead if we lose those ingredients? And that's a whole conversation we could have on its own, right? Number two, the proper role of government. John Locke, in his masterpiece, The Second Treatise Concerning Government, argued that the proper role of government is limited to defense of life, liberty, and property, nothing else. He got that idea from Genesis. God gave us the earth to till. Well, first of all, we are God's. We are God's children. We are beholden to him. We have to answer to him. He gives us commandments that we are accountable for, whether in this life or next. And he gave us the earth to till and take care of. The mixture of our life or time with the products of nature become our property. Therefore, because we are God's children, no one has a right to injure us, our loved ones, or take our things. And from that is derived our right of self-defense. That's where it comes from. This idea from Genesis that we're made in the image of God, that we are his children. He has given us laws to obey. We have to obey them. We are accountable to him for them. And we can't just go and take someone's life, injure them, steal their stuff, etc., without incurring the wrath of God. Therefore, we have a right to self-defense. And because we hold those rights individually, we can also justly delegate the exercise of those rights to another person, because we each individually hold them ourselves. So a sheriff, a government, we can delegate and say, I'm going to hire you to take on the job of defense, of protection of life, liberty, and property. And we can justly do that because we ourselves have that right. Now there's other things we can't delegate because we don't hold them ourselves. We can't delegate the right to steal. We can't delegate to the government the right to steal because we don't have that right ourselves. There's a whole conversation to be had there, but I'm just briefly summarizing Locke. So by delegating those rights, or delegating that job, that responsibility, that duty, that right-based duty to government, it allows us to have time that we're not spent guarding our lives and our stuff. We can make a living, raise a family, develop our talents, etc. And as I said a moment ago, because we have no other right to use force on our fellow man other than in the defense of life, liberty, and property, so too does government have no other proper role than those three things. And if you carefully read Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution, which outlines the 18 powers delegated by we the people to Congress, you'll find out that each can be traced to one of those three rights. Now, that's a whole conversation of its own. We don't have time to get into right here, but that's a fascinating study. It's going and looking and say, wait, what did they actually what did we the people actually tell Congress you can do? It all had to do with those three things, and everything else was relegated to the people or the states. So all other social goods and values, everything else we want to accomplish, can only justly be done or pursued through persuasion, cooperation, consent, compassion, and competition, not through force. Giving space for and allowing maximum use of liberty for each of us to be anxiously engaged in a good cause, as we read in D&C 58. Deeply and meaningfully involved in our communities and negating the disconnect, discord, and corruption inherent in the centralizing of power. There's so much we could go into there. There's a whole arc from Aristotle to Locke about the building of friendships to communities. It contains the recipe for, it's like the antidote for so much that ails our societies today. If we were to study these writers and understand these principles and return to them, I think a lot of the social ills that we are so that really cause a lot of strife and grief for us, they would be significantly reduced. But would that work in real life? Would people really band together and work to help their communities? The answer is yes. We used to do it a lot. We still do to some degree, but we used to do it even more. When Alexis de Tocqueville wrote his observations about 19th century American society in his landmark work, Democracy in America, which is essential reading, he remarked, quote, "In the United States, as soon as several inhabitants have taken an opinion or an idea they wish to promote in society, they seek each other out and unite together. From that moment, they are no longer isolated, but have become a power seen from afar, whose activities serve as an example and whose words are heeded. Americans group together to hold celebrations, found seminaries, build inns, construct churches, distribute books, dispatch missionaries to the natives. They establish hospitals, prisons, schools by the same method. Finally, if they wish to highlight a truth or develop an opinion by the encouragement of a great example, they form an association." So this idea of freedom of association and the proliferation of associations that used to be part and parcel of being an American. This is now 200 years ago. It was in the 1830s was when Tocqueville came around. He saw this just happening all the time, that they would see a need and a community would see a need and they would band together and create some kind of a society or association, and they would work on that problem. So the church that I belong to, I see as an example of one such association. It was actually created when Tocqueville was here in America, or right before it. So is the Red Cross or your local PTA. Under the constitutional model, we the people are meant to do more for society and within our communities than just form government. We the people form government. Government has a very specific small role, and we form other institutions, families, churches, schools, businesses, media, the arts, etc., that we establish, work together, collaborate, cooperate, compete, but we don't coerce. To realize our talents and to meet the needs of our society. The next one, God's law is higher than man's law. So in the book of Exodus and 1 Samuel, we get the revolutionary idea that there exists a higher law that all human laws must be in harmony with, otherwise the human law is unjust and invalid. So when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with God's law, it didn't matter what the majority of Israelites wanted to do if their desire was contrary to God's law. When King Saul disobeyed God's law, he willingly recognized and accepted Samuel's authority over him as God's mouthpiece. You might remember this from your Bible studies. In other words, the king was also subject. He didn't just tell Samuel to go take a hike. He recognized Samuel's authority over him as king, that the prophet was higher than the king. He recognized a law higher than himself. Marcus Tullius Cicero, who lived much later, but 50 years before Christ, concurred with this principle. He wrote a masterpiece on the Commonwealth. Again, another one that's just mandatory reading for all citizens of Western civilization. Cicero, this great defender of the Roman Republic, spoke of what he called true law, stating that, quote, "all nations at all times will be bound by this one eternal and unchangeable law," end quote, and that God is, quote, "the one common master and general of all the people, the author, expounder, and mover of this law, and the person who does not obey it will be in exile from himself, because in doing so he scorns his nature as a human being. By this very fact he will pay the greatest penalty, even if he escapes all other things that are generally recognized as punishments," end quote. Cicero, like the Jews before him and the Christians after him, recognized that there's a law above human law, and that justice will be served whether it's rendered in this life or the next. So life is not just about doing whatever you want. There's actually a law that we have to we have to conform ourselves individually and societally to. So that's the reason why, for example, when you go to the United States Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., you'll see the 10 Commandments and Moses inscribed up there on the building. Our founders recognized this higher law. And it was from that principle, after all, that they could separate or justify separation from Great Britain in the first place. For in keeping with the true law, the Declaration of Independence eloquently proclaimed, quote, when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security, end quote. Where does that right and duty come from? From God's law. And so if a country is, if a government is, well, I just read the quote, right? We're pretty familiar with that part of the Declaration of Independence, but that's where they got their authority through. They were claiming their right to a higher power than the British government. There was a higher power, a higher law that they were appealing to. That's how our country was founded, by appealing to that higher law. Next principle, subsidiarity. Most Americans haven't heard of the name, though they may be familiar with it in concept. In the book of Exodus, which is where this comes from, we find the ministry and writings of Moses, where we learn that the responsibility and actions, or that responsibility and action, should take place at the lowest possible level in a society. So individuals should do for individuals what they can for themselves. Marriages should do all that they can for themselves. Families, both nuclear and extended, should do all they can for themselves, and so on and so forth, up the social and political hierarchy. So you try to solve it at the closest level to the problem. If something can't be handled at the proper level, you look at the next highest level. You don't jump. This teaches responsibility and accountability. It discourages laziness and entitlement. It places incentives and rewards, actions and consequences in their proper place, and is in perfect harmony with God's intent for our use of liberty, to obey him in developing ourselves and helping our neighbor. And subsidiarity is in perfect harmony, I think, with our next principle, which is the separation of powers and federalism. So D&C, Doctrine and Covenants 88, commands us, quote, seek ye, or to seek ye, out of the best books, words of wisdom. Seek learning, even by study, and also by faith, end quote. So we're told to study, among other things, the perplexities of nations and to gain a knowledge of countries and kingdoms. Some of the best books on those subjects are the words written by the founding generation of this country or by those whom the founding generation themselves studied. President Ezra Taft Benson in General Conference admonished the members of the church to read one of those best books called the Federalist Papers, which were written by John Jay, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, with the express purpose of explaining and defending the Constitution. I testify of the importance of those papers. If we have not read them, we cannot understand our liberties. We cannot protect them. And I'm going to share just one principle from them, though there are many. In Doctrine and Covenants 121:39, written in 1839, we read, quote, we have learned by sad experience that it is the nature and disposition of almost all men, as soon as they get a little authority as they suppose, they will immediately begin to exercise unrighteous dominion, end quote. 30 years later, in 1870, Lord Acton famously described the same principle when he said, and you've probably heard this one before, quote, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Great men are almost always bad men. You never hear that part of the quote, right? You always hear the power tends to corrupt. You never hear the second part of the quote, which is great men are almost always bad men. Let's like pause and let that sink in for a minute. It's like, really? Really? If so, wow, what is that? What are the implications for our way we vote, the way we listen to debates, the way we select our electors, our candidates? So great men are almost always bad men, even when they exercise influence and not authority. Still more when you superimpose the tendency or the certainty of corruption by authority. Power corrupts. This principle was well known to the founders. In Federalist 9, Alexander Hamilton mourned the wretched nurseries of unceasing discord of earlier democracies where power was allowed to centralize. Once power centralizes, persuasion and cooperation give way to power struggles and coercion. This would be a good time to stop the recording and go give some thought. Where have you seen power struggles and coercion in society? Power corrupts and power centralizes. In Federalist 10, James Madison, often referred to as the father of the Constitution, wrote of factions, which he defined as a number of citizens united by some common passion or interest to use force to impose their desired will on the rest of their fellow citizens. He'd said that you can't destroy faction without destroying liberty. Therefore, the solution lies in limiting the uses of force that the government has at its disposal to just the protection of life, liberty, and property. So not only do we have the principle of the proper role of government, of minimizing the role of government, which has a monopoly on force, to the protection of life, liberty, and property, which is the only legitimate use of force any one of us possesses individually, but we also separate the legislative, executive, and judicial components of that power into three, and then three again at the federal, state, and local levels. This concept of federalism, like horizontal and vertical separations of power, act like the watertight bulkheads in a ship. If one becomes corrupted or flooded, the rest of the ship doesn't immediately sink, giving sailors, or in our case, citizens, time to fix the breach. Not only does this, in theory, resist the centralization of power, but it facilitates the great laboratories of democracy idea, in which citizens of each state can work to solve societal problems without risk to the rest of the country, and the rest of the country can learn from and build upon the efforts of others. We can see, how is Kansas doing it? How is Oklahoma doing it? Rather than it being mandated top down and saying everyone's going to do it the same, we have all these laboratories figuring things out. Lots more we could talk about there as well on the separations of power and federalism. But let's move on for now to morality. Only immoral people can be free. Otherwise, they will require masters. Only immoral people will avoid the temptation to use government to further their own interests. Only immoral people will exercise the wisdom, judgment, and self-sacrifice to create healthy, prosperous families and communities. The founders knew this as well. George Washington, our first president, famously said in his farewell address, and this is a lengthy one, this is a lengthy quote, most of you probably heard parts of this before, quote, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness." Religion and morality are great pillars of human happiness. These firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life? If the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, where are the instruments of investigation in the courts of law? And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. John Adams, our second president, agreed with him. He said, quote, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Sometimes, and end quote, sometimes we hear the argument that you can't expect people to be good and do all the good necessary to solve society's problems. But the truth is that a moral people is necessary to any non-tyrannical form of government that aspires to any pretense of freedom. You expect people to be good. An open society expects people to, by and large, be good. Societal freedom is only possible in an environment of individual self-control. That same self-control is the twin of charitable impulses. They go together. Those who exercise self-control, who are good, also want to reach out and help their fellow man. That progression also, it's in Christianity, and you see it in Aristotle as well. Then the question arises, well, whose morality are we to live? What morality? Our political solution was built on a Judeo-Christian moral framework. We must study and live the teachings of the master teacher, our Savior and exemplar, Jesus Christ. He teaches us how to be sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, employers and employees, neighbors and citizens. Well, what about the separation of church and state? At bottom, there is no such thing. Everyone has a religion, a set of values they live by or want everyone else to live by, whether they believe in God or not. And laws or legislation is simply the codifying of someone's set of values and imposing it on everyone else. That's what law is. For this reason, the founders minimized the role of government, which has a monopoly on force, so that the levers of power would be used for the protection of fundamental rights only, which, being honest, is itself an imposition of a value set or religion. That's why I say there is no such thing as a separation of church and state, because the founders valued life, liberty, and property and enshrined protections for them in the law. That was their religion. That's what they passed laws for. You can't get away from it. All law, all states, all governments are the imposition of someone's value set, whether it's theistic or not. You can't get away. There is no such thing really as a separation of church and state. But the one the founders set up is the minimum possible value set, founded on Christian scripture and Christian compatible philosophies of men. And they said everything else should be pursued through persuasion and cooperation. That's how you separate church and state. You limit the state to the protection of life, liberty, and property and say everything else has to be done through cooperation, consent, persuasion, etc., not coercion. That's how you do the separation of church and state. Knowledge and wisdom. This will be my last one. Thomas Jefferson said, quote, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and never will be, end quote. And he also said, and most people have probably heard this, that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. We, the citizens, must study the principles of freedom. President Benson called on our people to elect good, wise, and honest men and women to office. He was simply reiterating Doctrine and Covenants 98:10, which tells us, quote, honest men and wise men should be sought for diligently, and good men and wise men ye shall observe to uphold, end quote. So I ask again, have we apostatized as a nation from some of these core principles, as a modern prophet has warned? That we are made in the image of God, that equality means equal before God and the law, that happiness is the pursuit of godliness, that life is sacred, that the proper use of liberty is to choose virtue, that human law must be in harmony with God's law, that the proper role of government is the protection of life, liberty, and property, that subsidiarity, federalism, and the separation of powers prevent corruption and center incentive, action, and consequence on the proper shoulders, and that morality is essential to a free people, and that knowledge and wisdom is essential to be an effective and a responsible citizen. Have we apostatized from it? Have we moved away from any of those principles? What has happened as a result? What are examples that you can think of? We could talk about that for a very long time. The duties of citizenship cannot be delegated. We can delegate the study of bridge building to the engineers, the study of dentistry to the dentists, the study of flight to the pilots, but we can't delegate politics to the politicians. Moral and political philosophy must in some degree be understood and lived by each of us, since the power is in the people, or as President Joseph F. Fielding Smith warned, we will have a change of government. In truth, we already have had a change in government in important ways. After all, what else does apostasy mean? It's a change. And actually, such a change becomes necessary. In 1748, the French philosopher Baron Charles de Montesquieu published his seminal work, The Spirit of the Laws, which was profoundly influential on the founding generation. He, for example, articulated there the need for key concepts like the separation of powers, which we spoke about earlier, which we see in all modern governments today. But he also said there that the spirit of the law must match the heart of the people. They have to be compatible, or the people will be ungovernable. The law cannot be so different from the people, or else they won't abide by it. And God himself illustrated that principle when he took the higher law from the children of Israel and gave them instead the law of Moses. As a people stray further from God's laws, they are less capable of freedom. There are other forms of government out there that are detrimental to human freedom and flourishing. We don't have to dig very deep into history or current events to see just how blessed we are to live in this nation, however far we may have strayed thus far. In 1878, British Prime Minister William Gladstone described the American Constitution as the most wonderful work ever struck off at a given time by the brain and purpose of man. He was right. We must do the difficult work of understanding and preserving it. Our attitude must be that of Thomas Paine, who said, "If there must be trouble, let it be in my day, that my child may have peace." 80 years ago, in celebration of I Am an American Day, which never even heard of that until I was researching for this talk, I Am an American Day, Judge Learned Hand had this to say, quote, "I often wonder whether we do not rest our hopes too much upon constitutions, upon laws, and upon courts. These are false hopes. Believe me, these are false hopes." This is a judge speaking. "Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. While it lies there, it needs no constitution, no law, no court to save it. And what is this liberty which must lie in the hearts of men and women? It is not the ruthless, the unbridled will. It is not the freedom to do as one likes. That is the denial of liberty and leads straight to its overthrow. A society in which men recognize no check upon their freedom soon becomes a society where freedom is the possession of only a savage few, as we have learned to our sorrow." End quote. So in closing, the good news is that if we understand correct principles, we can advocate for them. We can eloquently and lovingly express them. We can live them. We can teach them to our children. We can select candidates and vote accordingly. On this Constitution Day, I bear my personal testimony of these principles. We are the third Christian civilization to live in this land. The first two, the Jaredites and the Nephites, fell because they did not hearken to the covenants they made with the Lord. They experienced a change of government. It is my prayer that as a people we will fulfill our responsibility to do, as President Benson said, quote, "bear the Constitution away from the very verge of destruction," end quote. Its principles are part and parcel of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Wherefore, how great the importance to make these things known unto the inhabitants of the earth, and that we may do so is my prayer. Thanks for listening.